Something is happening, something big and profound, and that was already predicted more than a century ago. Today, more than ever, the warnings left by the Virgin Mary in Fatima echo like a cry in the silence, asking to be heard. For decades, they were kept secret, fragmented, incomplete, or so many believe. But the signs around us are increasingly evident. Something has changed, and what is to come could forever alter the destiny of humanity. Have you ever wondered why, in times of great turmoil, some historical events seem to resonate with the words of the prophesies? Why messages like those of Fatima, that seemed so distant, now fit almost perfectly with what we live today? We are not talking about coincidences. We are talking about a greater plan, of a series of warnings left by a divine force to alert us, prepare us, and perhaps save us. The apparitions of Fatima in 1917 were a unique event in the history of faith. 3 simple shepherd children witnessed something that would shake the Catholic Church and leave deep marks on modern history. The Virgin Mary appeared to them with a clear message divided into 3 parts: a terrifying vision of hell, a warning about wars and crises, and finally, a 3rd secret that would be kept in total mystery for decades. But here's the thing: while the first 2 secrets were revealed quickly, the 3rd was literally locked in a safe. Why? What was the content so disturbing that the very church felt the world was not ready to hear it? When a version of this secret finally came to light in 2000, many believers and scholars felt something was missing. Was the prophecy softened to avoid panic, or were crucial parts deliberately hidden? These questions remain. And meanwhile, the world seems to be following exactly the course described by these warnings: spiritual crises, natural disasters, violence, and an ever-increasing distance from the faith. What you are about to discover is not just a story but a calling. This video is not just another content to pass the time. It is an invitation to reflect, question, and above all, act. Because contrary to what many believe, time is not on our side. We are living at a crossroads in history. On one side, we see an unprecedented technological and material advance. On the other, a moral and spiritual collapse that threatens to erode the foundations of what makes us truly human. When the Virgin Mary appeared in Fatima, her message was clear: humanity needed to change its course or face unimaginable consequences. Today, more than 100 years later, these consequences seem to be unfolding before our eyes. But the answer lies in the choices we make every day. As individuals and as a society, we are moving away from our values, allowing materialism and indifference to take over our lives. The prophesies were not made to scare, but to open our eyes. Are we willing to see? Throughout this video, we will delve deep into the hidden meaning of the 3rd secret of Fatima. We will explore the reasons why it was kept secret and reveal the disturbing connections to the events we see around us today. This is a journey of discovery, but also of responsibility, so stay until the end. Every second matters. What you will hear here is not just a story, it is a truth that can transform your life. When we talk about Fatima, we are not just remembering a religious event, we are unraveling one of the most intriguing and controversial mysteries in modern history. In 1917, in a small village in Portugal, something extraordinary happened. 3 children, Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta, claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary in a series of apparitions that would transform their lives and shake the Catholic Church. But what did these apparitions mean? And why do they still generate so much debate more than a century later? On May 13, 1917, the three children were herding sheep when they witnessed something that defied any natural explanation. A lady brighter than the sun appeared to them, bringing an urgent message. She would return on 5 other occasions, always to the same place, carrying revelations that would become known as the secrets of Fatima. What makes this event so impactful is not just the account of the depth of the messages transmitted by the Virgin. It was not a mere spiritual vision. They were clear and direct warnings, a call to the world to change direction. What was said there was not to comfort, it was to warn. These secrets were progressively revealed and were divided into 3 parts. The first vision was of hell, where they saw a terrifying image of souls being consumed by flames, tormented by demons. It was a vision of eternal suffering, and the Virgin's message was clear: if humanity does not repent, many souls will fall into this abyss. The second prophecy concerned wars and tribulations. The second secret predicted events that would mark the 20th century. Mary warned that if the world did not turn to God, a war even worse than the present one would occur. The First World War would happen, and it also spoke about the emergence of an atheist regime that would spread its errors throughout the world. This regime, later identified as communism, would be one of the forces that devastated faith and spiritual values. Up to this point, the messages were already frightening, but the most intriguing was to come: the third secret. This secret was given to the children with specific instructions that it should be revealed to the world in 1960. However, when the date arrived, the Vatican made a decision that would leave millions of faithful perplexed. The content would not be disclosed. The official justification was that the world was not yet ready to hear it. This decision only increased curiosity and speculation. What could be so impactful as to justify decades of silence? What was in that sealed envelope that not even the fervor of the faithful could bring to light? For more than 40 years, the Church kept the secret under lock and key, fueling theories and debates. Some people believed that the content was so devastating that it could cause panic on a global scale. Others speculated that the prophecy predicted the end of the Church as we know it, or even a great calamity that would affect the very future of humanity. When, finally, in 2000, the Vatican decided to reveal the contents of the third secret, the reaction was mixed. The official account described a symbolic vision: a bishop dressed in white climbing a hill in ruins, accompanied by faithful and priests, while everyone was murdered by soldiers. This description was interpreted as a reference to the attack on Pope John Paul II in 1981. But there was something that didn't fit. Many theologians and scholars believed that the version released was incomplete. Where was the message that so disturbed the popes? Where were the details that could justify absolute secrecy for so many decades? Sister Lucia, one of the visionaries, taught during her life that the true meaning of the third secret was much deeper. According to her, it was a serious spiritual warning about the loss of faith within the Church itself, a moral and spiritual collapse that could lead humanity into chaos. Today, many believe that this part of the prophecy still remains hidden. And while the mystery persists, the events around us seem increasingly aligned with the warnings of Fatima. Could we be witnessing the beginning of the fulfillment of this prophecy? If the third secret really warned about a global spiritual crisis, has it already begun? For decades, the third secret of Fatima remained shrouded in mystery, kept in a sealed envelope and stored in the secret archives of the Vatican. Only the Pope and some members of the high clergy had access to its contents. When the year 1960 arrived, as had been indicated by the Virgin Mary herself, the world anxiously awaited the revelation. But instead of hearing the words that many believed to be crucial to the destiny of humanity, there was silence. The Vatican decided not to disclose the contents of the third secret. The official justification was that the world was not yet ready. This decision plunged millions of believers and scholars into a sea of questions. After all, if the first two parts of the secret were already alarming, a vision of hell and a warning about wars and spiritual crises, what could possibly be in the third secret that would justify such secrecy? It was only in 2000, after a long wait, that the Vatican finally revealed a version of the third secret. According to the official text, the message contained a symbolic vision. A bishop dressed in white, interpreted as the Pope, climbing a hill in the middle of a devastated city. He is accompanied by other religious and faithful, all murdered by soldiers amidst corpses scattered along the way. The Vatican's explanation connected this vision to the attack suffered by Pope John Paul II in 1981. In fact, the date of the attack coincided with the anniversary of the first apparition of the Virgin in Fatima. But was that vision the complete secret? Where were the spiritual details and the direct warnings that so many were waiting for? Church leaders like Pope John and Pope Paul reacted so seriously when they read the secret. And more intriguing still, Sister Lucia, the last surviving member of the Shepherd Children, had suggested that the content was much deeper and more terrifying than had been disclosed. Theologians and scholars began to question Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who would later become Pope Benedict. Pius XII once hinted that the third secret dealt with a great spiritual crisis, including the danger of a collapse of faith within the Church itself. This idea is reinforced by excerpts from interviews and letters attributed to Sister Lucia that mention an apostasy, that is, a widespread loss of faith. These indications nourish theories that the official Vatican version was not complete. Many believe that the darkest parts of the third secret were deliberately omitted to avoid panic or division among the faithful. After all, what could be more devastating than the idea of a deep spiritual crisis that would begin within the Church itself? Other theories suggest that the third secret contains a warning about global events of catastrophic proportions. Some speak of nuclear wars, while others point to environmental and social collapses, combined with an ever-increasing distance from God and spiritual values. Regardless of which theory is true, one thing is certain: the partial revelation of the third secret failed to silence doubts. On the contrary, it opened space for more questions. Why did the Vatican take so long to deliver this message? Could the delay have been strategic, an attempt to prepare humanity to hear something so impactful? Or was it a way to protect the Church itself from controversies that could shake its authority? And there is still another important question: whether the message of the third secret is really a spiritual warning. Do we still have time to respond to it? Could the choices made by humanity in recent times have put us on the path to calamity described in the visions of Fatima? While these questions remain unanswered, the signs around us continue to disturb: the loss of faith, social polarization, the increasingly frequent natural disasters, and global conflicts seem to echo the warnings of Fatima. Are we living in the first chapters of a prophetic setting? The warnings of the apparitions of Fatima do not belong only to the past. Despite their origin in a small village in Portugal at the beginning of the 20th century, the impact of these messages transcends time and continues to echo with undeniable urgency. What was said to the three little shepherds, Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta, seems more relevant than ever. And the question that arises is: are we already living the fulfillment of these prophecies? When we observe the current world, the parallels with the messages of Fatima are impossible to ignore. The widespread loss of faith, the increase of violence, the increasingly frequent natural disasters, and social polarization are symptoms of a society that seems to be heading towards a breaking point. The warnings of Fatima point directly to this: a humanity that, by moving away from God, opens the doors to a period of tribulation. Consider the first part of the prophecy of Fatima, a terrifying vision of hell. For the little shepherds, this was a vivid and unbearable concrete image. For us, it can be interpreted as a reflection of the spiritual and social consequences of abandoning faith and morality. It is not difficult to see that when we look at the world, many live in a state of despair and existential emptiness, a true hell on earth. The second part of the message, which predicted wars and global crises, also seems to be unfolding before our eyes. The First and Second World Wars were just the first acts of a scenario of conflicts that persist to this day, with growing tensions between great powers such as the United States, Russia, and China. Add to this the risks of a nuclear confrontation, and it becomes clear that the warnings of Fatima are still frighteningly current. And what about the third secret, shrouded in mystery for so long? The official interpretation speaks of a bishop dressed in white climbing a hill in ruins, a scene of destruction and martyrdom. Many scholars see this as a metaphor for a spiritual crisis within the Church itself. And today, we face, for example, a collapse of values, scandals that shake the faith of the faithful, and a growing religious indifference throughout the world. Secularism and materialism, so warned about in the prophecies of Fatima, now dominate global society. The incessant search for wealth, power, and pleasure has replaced the spiritual values that previously guided the decisions of people and nations. Churches are emptier, families are fragmented, and faith seems to be relegated to a secondary plane. But the warnings of Fatima did not stop in Portugal. They spread throughout the world, and the message now seems to have a specific focus. In certain nations, the United States, for example, has historically been seen as a symbol of religious freedom, but today faces internal divisions that reflect a deep spiritual crisis. A country marked by a strong Marian devotion now sees its traditional faith weaken, as it faces an unprecedented wave of violence and corruption. Is it a coincidence that these countries, so linked to religiosity, are at the center of such intense crises? Or are the warnings of Fatima showing us that these places have a crucial role in the global spiritual battle that is unfolding? Natural disasters also raise disturbing questions. Hurricanes, fires, earthquakes, and floods are becoming more frequent and devastating, as scientists point out. As global warming as the main cause, but many wonder, what if these events are more than just natural phenomena? Could they be signs of something bigger, like the tribulations mentioned in the prophecies? By connecting the messages of Fatima to current events, it becomes evident that there is something more at stake. The world is at a moment of transition, a crossroads where the choices made today will define the future of all humanity. But what does this mean for you? The warnings were not made just for the powerful or for religious institutions. They are an individual call for each person. We are all being called to reflect on the path we are taking, to reconsider our priorities, and to seek spiritual renewal. However, time is short. The prophecies of Fatima are a reminder that the consequences of turning away from God can be devastating, but also a promise that there is still hope. The Virgin Mary made it clear that conversion, prayer, and penance can change the course of history. When we think of the warnings of Fatima, it is natural to imagine that they were intended for all humanity. However, when observing global events, it is impossible to ignore the specific role of certain nations in the fulfillment of these prophecies. Among them, the United States and Mexico emerge as unexpected protagonists, for different reasons, but deeply connected to the spiritual scenario described by the Virgin Mary in 1917. The United States, often called the Land of Liberty, has historically been a symbol of faith and hope for the world. Founded on principles that exalted religious freedom, the country has always been seen as a bastion of protection for communities of faith and Christian values. During the Cold War, the nation played a crucial role in opposing atheistic communism, the same ideology that, according to the second secret of Fatima, represented a serious spiritual threat. However, the current reality of the United States contrasts sharply with this historical image. Although it still houses vibrant religious communities, the country faces an unprecedented spiritual and moral crisis, political polarization, cultural conflicts, and unbridled materialism corrode the values that once defined the nation. Churches are increasingly empty, faith is often relegated to private matters, and secularism has taken over popular culture. Even worse, the cultural impact of the United States on the rest of the world is undeniable. Through cinema, music, and social networks, the country exports values that often promote consumerism, hedonism, and spiritual disconnection. This widespread materialistic lifestyle is seen by many as one of the forces accelerating global spiritual decline. Could the United States, once a defender of the faith, now have become an agent of spiritual weakening? And Mexico? This country occupies a unique place in the context of the prophecies of Fatima. The nation is marked by a deep Marian devotion, being the home of the Virgin of Guadalupe, one of the greatest symbols of the Catholic faith throughout the world. For centuries, Mexico was seen as a stronghold of Catholicism in Latin America, a place where faith flourished even in the face of extreme hardship. However, as in the United States, something has changed. The faith that once united the Mexican people is now in decline, especially among the younger generations. Churches are empty, and traditional religious ceremonies that were once sacred to families are now ignored. At the same time, Mexico is facing a profound social and moral crisis marked by extreme violence from drug trafficking and endemic corruption that undermines trust in institutions. We are living in a period of great change, but also of deep crises. For those who pay attention, the warnings left at Fatima not only seem to make sense, but also become impossible to ignore when they are seen. Mary warned of a future of wars, spiritual crises, and global suffering. Her words sounded like a distant echo today, yet they resonate directly in the reality around us. The spiritual crisis described in the prophecies of Fatima is not just a theological concept, it manifests itself in very concrete ways. What we are seeing is a society increasingly disconnected from its spiritual essence, immersed in materialism, in the search for immediate pleasure, and in indifference towards the values that were once the basis of humanity. In recent decades, this disconnection has intensified. The advancement of technology has brought undeniable benefits, but has also deepened an existential void. Social networks, instant entertainment, and unbridled consumption have distracted people from the essential issues of life. Faith, that was once a pillar of support in times of difficulty, is now often seen as something outdated and irrelevant to a generation that prioritizes the here and now. The most visible reflection of this spiritual crisis is in the loss of faith and in the decline of religious practices. In countries like the United States, churches that were once packed now struggle to keep their doors open. In Mexico, a country with a history of Marian devotion, traditional religious festivities lose meaning among younger people. This growing indifference is not only a cultural phenomenon, it is evidence that humanity is moving away from its spiritual roots. But the crisis is not just personal, it is also collective. We see increasingly divided societies, marked by ideological conflicts, political polarization, and intolerance. Values such as compassion, solidarity, and respect for others are being replaced by hate speech and the desire for self-affirmation. The prophecy of Fatima warned of a great apostasy, a loss of faith within the church itself and in society as a whole. Today, this prediction seems to be coming true. However, the spiritual crisis also reflects in the physical environment. Natural disasters are becoming more frequent and devastating. Hurricanes, earthquakes, forest fires, and floods are shaking countries around the world. Although science points to global warming and climate change as the main causes, many see these events as signs of something greater, as scriptures and prophecies talk about signs on earth and in the sky, events that will serve as warnings to humanity. Are we witnessing these signs now? Another disturbing aspect of the crisis is the increase in violence and social instability. Countries that were once considered bastions of security and morality now face challenges such as urban violence, extreme inequality, and the collapse of public institutions. Mexico, for example, is struggling with an epidemic of violence linked to drug trafficking, while the United States faces mass shootings and growing social divisions. These events, although they can be attributed to political and economic factors, also reveal a spiritual disconnection. The global spiritual crisis is not an isolated event. It affects every aspect of our lives, from our interpersonal relationships to the way we organize ourselves as a society. And according to the warnings of Fatima, it can be the prelude to even greater tribulations. The Virgin Mary made it clear that without prayer and penance, humanity would face suffering on an unprecedented scale. But there is something that makes this crisis even more alarming: the silence. While the signs are everywhere, many choose to ignore them. Some dismiss the prophesies as superstitions or old legends, while others simply do not have time to reflect on spiritual matters. And that is exactly what the prophesies of Fatima warn about: the danger of becoming so absorbed by the material world that we lose sight of what really matters. The good news is that the warnings of Fatima were not just to condemn, but also to offer hope. They are a call to conversion, to prayer, and reconnect Ion. The Virgin Mary promises that if humanity would heed the call, a time of peace would be granted. However, the warnings given at Fatima not only seem to make sense, but also make it impossible to ignore them. When the Virgin Mary warned of a future of wars, spiritual crises, and global suffering, her words sounded like a distant echo today, yet they resonate directly in the reality around us. The spiritual crisis described in the prophesies of Fatima is not just a theological concept. It manifests itself in very concrete ways. What we are seeing is a society increasingly disconnected from its spirituality, immersed in materialism, in the search for immediate pleasure, and in indifference towards the values that were once the basis of humanity. In recent decades, this disconnection has intensified. The advancement of technology has brought undeniable benefits, but has also deepened an existential void. Social networks, instant entertainment, and unbridled consumption have distracted people from the essential issues of life. Faith, which was once a pillar of support in times of difficulty, is now often seen as something outdated and irrelevant to a generation that prioritizes the here and now. The most visible reflection of this spiritual crisis is in the loss of faith and the decline of religious practices. In countries like the United States, churches that were once packed now struggle to maintain their open doors. In Mexico, a country with a history of Marian devotion, traditional religious festivities are losing meaning among the youngest. This growing indifference is not only a cultural phenomenon. It is evidence that humanity is moving away from its spiritual roots. But the crisis is not just personal, it is also collective. We see increasingly divided societies marked by ideological conflicts, political polarization, and intolerance. Values such as compassion, solidarity, and respect for others are being replaced by hatred and a great apostasy. A complete rejection of faith seems to be unfolding. However, the spiritual crisis is also reflected in the physical environment. Natural disasters are becoming more frequent and devastating. Hurricanes, earthquakes, forest fires, and floods shake countries around the world. Although science points to global warming and climate change as the main causes, many see these events as signs of something greater. Scriptures and prophecies speak of signs on earth and in heaven, events that will serve as warnings to humanity. Are we witnessing these signs now? Another disturbing aspect of the crisis is the increase in violence and social instability. Countries that were once considered bastions of security and morality now face challenges such as urban violence, extreme inequality, and the collapse of public institutions. Mexico, for example, is battling an epidemic of drug-related violence, while the United States faces mass shootings and social divisions. These events, although they can be attributed to political and economic factors, also reveal a spiritual disconnect. The global spiritual crisis is not an isolated event. It affects every aspect of our lives, from our interpersonal relationships to the way we organize ourselves as a society, and according to Fatima's warnings, could be the prelude to even greater tribulations. The Virgin Mary made it clear that without prayer and penance, humanity would face suffering on an unprecedented scale. But there is something that makes this crisis even more alarming: the silence. While the signs are everywhere, many choose to ignore them. Some dismiss the prophecies as superstitions or outdated legends, while others simply do not have time to reflect on spiritual matters. And this is exactly what the Fatima prophecies warn about: the danger of becoming so absorbed by the material world that we lose sight of what really matters. The good news is that the warnings of Fatima were not just to condemn, but also to offer hope. They are a call to conversion, to prayer, and to reconnect with God. The Virgin Mary promised that if humanity heeded the call, a time of peace would be granted. However, this peace depends on our individual and collective choices. When we look at the current state of the world, it is impossible to ignore the signs around us. The violence that is intensifying, the natural disasters that are destroying lives on an unprecedented scale, and the social polarization that is dividing nations. All of this can be interpreted as part of a prophetic scenario. The messages of Fatima, transmitted more than 100 years ago, seem to find their fulfillment in contemporary events. The question that echoes is, are these signs coincidences, or are they warnings that we are on the threshold of the tribulations described by the Virgin Mary? Natural disasters have become increasingly frequent and devastating. Hurricanes, fires, floods, and earthquakes shake entire regions, leaving destruction, loss of life, and a profound emotional impact. While science points to climate change as a logical explanation, Scripture and prophecy point to something greater. The Bible, in passages like Luke 21 verse 11, speaks of signs that preceded times of tribulation. There will be great earthquakes, famines and pestilences in various places, and frightening sights. Could these disasters be the physical manifestation of a world that is moving away from God? Also consider the rise of social and political crises. Countries face increasingly intense internal divisions, with polarized populations and leaders unable to find common ground. This lack of unity and understanding is not just a matter of politics. It is a reflection of a deeper spiritual condition. The prophecy of Fatima warned that without conversion, humanity would face not only physical wars, but also spiritual and cultural wars that would begin within the nations themselves. And what about the spiritual decline that now seems to be everywhere? Churches that were once centers of vibrant communities are increasingly empty. Religion, which for centuries has been the moral and spiritual basis for millions, is becoming increasingly empty and is being replaced by materialistic and individualistic ideologies. This departure from faith is not just a cultural issue. It is exactly what Sister Lucia described as the great apostasy predicted in the third secret of Fatima, the loss of faith on a global scale. Another sign that cannot be ignored is the growth of tensions between great powers such as the United States, Russia, and China. The threats of war, the arms race, and geopolitical disputes create a climate of instability reminiscent of the period prior to the First and Second World Wars, both predicted in the prophecy of Fatima. Today, however, the risk is even greater. With nuclear weapons and advanced technologies, the potential for destruction is incomparable. The Virgin Mary warned that if humanity did not turn to God, the world would face even more devastating conflicts. We are approaching that point. But perhaps the sign that is more disturbing is the spiritual emptiness that so many people feel today, despite living in a connected world where information is within everyone's reach. We have never been so distant from each other. Loneliness, depression, and despair are silent epidemics that affect millions of people. This is not just a social or psychological problem, it is a direct consequence of distancing from God. When spiritual values are replaced by materialism and the incessant search for pleasure, the result is a void that no achievement or material good can fill. In Mexico, for example, a country historically devoted to faith, signs of spiritual decline are increasingly evident. Rampant drug-fueled violence and widespread corruption are eroding the foundations of a society that was once united by faith. For many, this situation is a direct reflection of the warnings of Fatima. A nation that is moving away from God faces the consequences in all social, political, and spiritual areas. In the United States, the situation is also alarming. Political polarization, religious attacks, and the increase in urban violence create an environment of instability that resonates with the prophesies. The country that was once a beacon of hope and faith for the world now seems divided, trapped in an internal struggle for its moral and spiritual identity. However, these signs are not just messages of condemnation. They are also invitations to reflection and action. The warnings of the Virgin Mary at Fatima were clear. There is still time to change the course of events, but the window of opportunity is closing. Every disaster, every crisis, every moment of suffering is a reminder that humanity needs to return to prayer, penance, and conversion. The question is, are we listening, or are we so distracted by worldly concerns that we ignore the signs that are unfolding before us? If the prophecies of Fatima sound like a warning, the current moment invites us to reflect on an essential question. What will be the future of humanity if we ignore the signs and warnings left by the Virgin Mary? The crossroads is before us. On one side, we have the path of conversion through prayer and reconnection with God. On the other, a path that leads to more suffering, chaos, and destruction. The final destination depends on the choices we make now. The messages of Fatima were delivered more than a century ago, but their implications are still current. The Virgin Mary was clear in stating that the world would face great tribulations if one did not return to God. In the second prophecy, she warned about the outbreak of a new world war and the emergence of an atheistic ideology that would sow persecution and violence. Both predictions were fulfilled in a painful way. However, the third prophecy carries something even more profound, the idea of a spiritual collapse so devastating that it could transform humanity forever. Today, as the signs described in the prophecies become more evident, a disturbing question arises. Are we facing the last opportunities for change? When we look at the state of the world, with its natural disasters, divisions, crises of faith, and geopolitical conflicts, it is impossible not to see the warnings of Fatima taking shape. The great spiritual crisis predicted in the third prophecy is not just a metaphor. It is visible in the loss of moral values and the spiritual disconnection that dominate today's societies. More than that, this is a crisis that threatens the very essence of what it means to be human. The Virgin Mary alerted that without prayer and penance, humanity would move further and further away from God, plunging into a cycle of suffering and destruction. What makes the future even more uncertain is the speed at which these signs are intensifying, the frequency and magnitude of natural disasters, the political polarization in countries like the United States, and the moral crisis in deeply religious nations like Mexico show that time is running out. But what if we chose the other path? The Virgin Mary also offered a promise: peace would be granted to the world if humanity heeded the call of conversion. Consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, acts of prayer, and sincere devotion could transform the destiny of humanity. This is not just a promise of hope, it is a real alternative to avoid the tragedies that loom on the horizon. However, for this change to happen, a collective effort is needed. It is not just about religious or political leaders, but about each individual recognizing their role in this process. The Virgin Mary emphasized that every act of prayer, every gesture of kindness, and every effort to live according to spiritual principles contribute to the transformation of the world. The future of humanity is in our hands, but the choice cannot be delayed any longer. As global events continue to align with the warnings of Fatima, the call to action becomes even more urgent. Ignoring the signs is no longer an option. Perhaps the most important question is what we are willing to sacrifice to avoid the tribulations that the Virgin Mary predicted. Are we ready to abandon materialism, divisions, and selfishness in favor of a path of faith, unity, and hope? The coming years will be decisive. If humanity continues on its current path, the prophecies of Fatima suggest that we will face more severe tribulations. However, if we choose repentance and prayer, a new time of peace may emerge. The outcome will depend on the choices we make as individuals and as a society. Over the decades, the messages of Fatima have echoed as a voice in the desert, asking humanity to wake up. Time passed, the signs intensified, and now we find ourselves facing what could be a turning point in history. The question that arises is, what will we do from here? The Virgin Mary left us a clear call, but it requires courage to be answered. This call is personal, but its effects can change the destiny of entire nations. Repentance, prayer, and reconnection with God are not just spiritual practices. They are the foundation of a new path, a future that can still be rescued. However, many hesitate. We live in a fast-paced world where distraction reigns, and few find time for introspection. But it is exactly this frenetic pace, focused on the material and the transitory, that takes us to the edge of the abyss. Each of us is called to make a choice: ignore the signs and continue toward chaos, or take responsibility for changing this. Change begins with small steps. The Virgin emphasized the power of prayer, especially the Rosary, as a spiritual weapon capable of combating the forces that divide and corrupt humanity. Each prayer is an act of faith, a direct connection with God, and a way of participating in the divine plan to restore peace. Personal conversion, however simple it may seem, has an impact that goes far beyond the individual. When we choose to live closer to spiritual values, we inspire those around us to do the same. The light of a heart that seeks God can illuminate an entire room of darkness. Imagine what millions of hearts like this would do for a world in crisis. But the call to action is not limited to the personal sphere. It extends to our communities, nations, and to the world. Mexico, so deeply connected to Marian spirituality, can rediscover its spiritual strength by rediscovering its devotion to the Virgin of Guadalupe. The United States, with its global cultural and political influence, can redirect its efforts to become a beacon of faith and morality again. Yet the question remains: what needs to happen for us to wake up? Do we need to wait for natural disasters to become even more devastating, for social and political divisions to reach a breaking point, or for more lives to be lost in wars and humanitarian crises? We cannot allow tragedy to be our only teacher. The signs are everywhere. The warnings of Fatima, once considered distant and symbolic, now seem glaring and urgent. But along with the signs, there is also hope, the promise of Mary: if we return to God, if we seek His mercy through prayer and penance, a time of peace will be granted. What does this mean in practical terms? It means setting aside moments daily for prayer, regardless of the chaos around us. It means looking at our own lives and recognizing where we can change, where we can move closer to the values we know are right. It means acting with compassion, helping those in need, and being an example of kindness in a world that often seems indifferent. More importantly, it means not losing faith, even when times are difficult. The prophecies of Fatima show us that darkness will never have the final word. God gave us free will, and with it, the ability to change our destiny. We are at a critical moment where every choice counts. The future is not yet written, but the present gives us the opportunity to shape it. Are you willing to be part of this change? The final message of Fatima is one of hope. No matter how dark the path may seem now, there is always light in the end, and this light depends on our decision to answer the call, not as spectators, but as protagonists of a spiritual transformation that can save not only our lives, but the entire world. May this be the moment to act. May this be the moment to listen. And may each step taken today bring us closer to the future of peace and redemption promised by the Virgin Mary.